Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Tales from the Wandering Scribe. I am your host, Gabriel Garcia, otherwise known as the Scribe. Today, we are having another historian interview today. For this episode, we have a very special guest. She is a writer, blogger, theologian, ancient historian, biblical scholar, researcher, editor, and podcaster for her own podcast series, Badass Women of History, which is on Anchor. Joining us is fellow historian and theologian, Princess Onaika Auguste. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much. It's actually Auguste.
Auguste.
Yes.
Auguste. My
It's
apologies.
it's of a French derivative, origin.
Ah,
Yes.
okay. Well, thank you, Auguste, for coming and joining us today. And tell us a little bit more about yourself. Tell us how you got into history as well as your other fields.
Okay, so I am from the island of St. Lucia, in the Caribbean. We are also known as the Helen of the West because
Mm,
um, the British and the French fought over 14 times, and we were 7 times British, 7 times French, hence play on the Greek myth, Helen of
right.
Troy. Yes. So the most beautiful island in the Caribbean, because Helen of Troy was the most beautiful woman in Greek mythology. Um, I was always into history, In St. Lucia, we have when you're in your last year, your last 2 years of high school, grade 12 and grade 11, which we call Form 4, Form 5. You're able to choose your subjects, and we have an exam called the Caribbean Examination Council, and history was one of my subjects.
Mm,
So I was always into history and mythology and religion. Um, I grew up Catholic, you know. My grandmother is Seventh Day Adventist, and then I have relatives who are atheists and relatives who, even though they're not atheists, they're spiritual. So,
okay. Nice. Very nice. Quite the pedigree. Quite the pedigree indeed. Now, as I know before, as I mentioned in the little introduction, you are working on your podcast, Badass Women of History. What can you tell us about that podcast and how did that come to be?
well, badass women of history started as a Twitter thread. Actually,
Hmm.
I was posting about women who we don't know much about, or who are demonized or erased from history. So I decided to start blogging about it after the Twitter Presence was so popular. So I started blogging about it, and then I stopped because I have other writings to do,
Right.
and I decided, you know what, I still want to do something about these women in history that have been erased and demonized, and so I decided to get out of my comfort zone and do badass women of history.
Nice. And listeners, if you follow her podcast as well as her Instagram, both Badass Women of History and Isle Theologian, you'll be able to see the women that she has slated. And of course, the very first episode is Cleopatra, which that leads into my next question. So, when you were creating the episode for Cleopatra, what ultimately did you want to explore? Because Cleopatra is probably one of the most famous queens in North Africa as well as Egypt in like the classical antiquities period. So, what did you want to explore about Cleopatra that may not have been covered in previous documentation?
Well, in the episodes I've covered mostly everything about her, but I gave my own historical conclusions and thoughts about the situations that were happening in her time. And I also wanted to get away from the fact that that she was a slut. And then the last episode, I get into how really her relationship with Mark Antony is not what the media and the Hollywood portrays as it was. Like, it was romantic and it was passionate. But actually, Cleopatra did not fall for Mark Antony at one time. He was in love with her. He wanted to set up a relationship with her. Caesar was not even cold in his urn when Mark Antony said he wanted to get with Cleopatra, but she refused.
Yeah, it's interesting because I completely agree. Especially the one movie that I think a lot of people know of Cleopatra is, of course, the one with Elizabeth Taylor, which heavily romanticized, the love triangle between Cleopatra, Mark Antony, Julius Caesar. I still enjoy that movie, but from a historical perspective, it's like that's how much of that is actually true and how much of that is just, as you say, Hollywood. And there's probably a lot of things we may not know about them going even further, about the kids that Cleopatra had with Julius Caesar, what became of them. And there's so much about Cleopatra that we really don't know about. And I think it's fascinating. I really enjoyed your insights into Cleopatra. And when making that uh, episode and the episodes coming after, what need or desire do you want to satisfy for your listeners, and what promise do you want to make to them for people who listen to this for the first time?
Well, I don't believe in making promises, but I hope that you learn more about Cleopatra beyond the Hollywood sensationalization of her relationships with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. I do talk about the relationships, especially the Mark Antony one, because her relationship with Mark Antony actually leads down to her downfall and suicide. So it's heavily needed to be discussed. I want people to see that it was, especially with her relationship with Caesar, it was a relationship of equals.
Right. Definitely. It is. That episode, you provide a lot of insight, and I really, really, really enjoy it. I haven't listened to the second part yet. I've only listened to the first part, but still in the first part, I was very, very impressed with the amount of historical insight you provide into who Cleopatra is and everything that surrounds her. She's probably one of my favorite queens of the classical period. And when you began this venture into podcasting, what was the overall feedback like from friends and family who knew of this project you're working on?
My friends have been very supportive, so they're listening and everything like that. My close friends, and I get a lot of listeners from my Twitter acquaintances and Instagram acquaintances. My family, my aunt and my cousins are very supportive. They haven't listened to the podcast yet, but they are very supportive of my other ventures. But they probably will eventually look at the podcast.
Very nice. Very, very nice. And probably one of my favorite questions to ask my guests is, when you began this podcast from the Twitter feed, and you were planning out, the roadmap of the women you want to cover, because there's a lot of famous queens and a lot of obscure queens and also famous women in history. That's like, how am I going to tell these stories when there's probably not a lot of information on them? And that's probably because of probably the people who knew them, or the region that they were in, if they were either conquered or destroyed by another nation. And that's kind of daunting. It's kind of intimidating to you want to gather all these information to present accurately. And ultimately, the question I do want to ask you is, when you're creating these outlines for these famous women in history, and you kind of get to a roadblock and thinking, should I stop? Have you ever thought of, I shouldn't stop? And like your why, what continues to push you to say, no, I'm going to do this. This is important. These topics need to be shared. What is your why?
My why is history has always been written by the victor, and in this case, men. And even though, like for the example of Cleopatra, most of the sources we have about her are from the Romans.
Right.
However, we do have Egyptian sources, and so you have to be able. I felt that I had to be able to, while I'm using these limited sources, I must um, be able to tell whether it's exaggeration or maybe there is some truth to it.
Definitely. And that's also another thing that's really important for learning about or studying classical texts, because, as you said, these texts, depending on who's the author, can be complete exaggerations, complete fabrications, but there may be an element of truth, and that requires like a lot of deep insight and studying into the stories or the people that are going about. But even if it was, let's say, a fabrication or exaggeration, that does also provide insight into the world around them. In a sense, if someone wrote an exaggeration tale about Cleopatra, you would think, okay, why would this person write an exaggeration? Who was this person? What was his station in either ancient Egypt or ancient Rome? What would he gain from these stories? So that does provide a window into another lens to explore Cleopatra, in sense, or anyone from the classical period, of how they were represented. Because there's a lot of different avenues for studying the classical period, and Cleopatra is no exception. There are probably numerous and countless sources from the Romans and Egyptians that we probably have yet to uncover and really, really figure out who she is. Because as you said, we have this iteration that she was like this very exotic femme fatale seductress who seduced two of the most powerful men in Roman history before the rise of the empire. But then you also look at her source and say, well, she was the only Greek who learned Egyptian. She was one of the most probably well respected and beloved queens at that period in time. So, as you said, we have to kind of find the truth in these exaggerations.
Yep. And a lot of the exaggerations is not necessarily the Romans that have done it, because if you listen to Roman sources, when you read the sources, they will say that it was not Cleopatra who seduced Antony, it was Antony who wanted to pick up a relationship with her. Although later you get Octavian, the future emperor, Augustus, using that propaganda, saying that she seduced Caesar and Antony to get what he wanted. But originally, some of the Roman sources, it does say that Antony was the one who wanted the relationship. So a lot of the erasure doesn't necessarily happen in ancient times, but it could also happen in modern day historical pop culture circles.
Right. Definitely. And still on the topic of pop culture, and you talked about how not Anthony, Augustus Caesar, how he would use the propaganda showing that Cleopatra seduced Mark Antony. I find it interesting is that I remember in the HBO series Rome, they really kind of went with that perspective that Cleopatra was this seductress, this queen. She was beautiful, who manipulated Caesar and Antony to their end. And she tried to do that with Octavian, who then became Augustus Caesar. And I'm thinking, well, would she, though? Would she try to have done that? I mean, possibly not. But Octavian was the most powerful man in Rome. He was the emperor, and he can weaponize the public, which is pretty much what he did to get people to join him. And it's fascinating how even today, that's kind of the angle that we're always telling. And I think you would agree with it. Like, we've seen that perspective so many times before. Let's actually show what possibly might have actually happened to Cleopatra. Did she try to do this? No. Well, what was the actual reason? And I wonder, and this is a little tangent question, why do you think we still perpetuate this Hollywood-esque iteration of Cleopatra and not probably do more research into her?
Cleopatra is something like a mystery. A mystery. She's mysterious. She's exotic. A lot of people in Hollywood in different political movements want to claim her, and so she's this mysterious woman, and so when you don't know much about this mysterious woman and you don't want to go and do the research, you go with what you were told or what you have read, and to make her more mysterious and exotic and
Right.
Eastern, in quotations, and foreign, you go with the first Roman emperor's propaganda.
Right, definitely. And speaking on the topic of research, growing up, what were your inspirations when it came to history, or your favorite historians that motivate you and still motivate you to do the best in history of your particular interests and fields?
I like Bethany Hughes.
Mm.
I love her. Just love her. Um, I, as an adult, I do like Cara Coney, an Egyptianologist. I do love her.
Ooh, okay.
We follow each other on Twitter, so probably don't know who I am, but still. Yeah.
Still.
I have a think. Back when I was growing up, I was more into Caribbean history at the time because so we did a lot of Caribbean history. Although I was also into Greek mythology and Greek history and the classic and Egyptianology, because we got a lot of National Geographic magazines, so I was always reading them and cutting out the pictures of the pyramids and the ancient stuff.
Nice.
Putting in my bedroom wall. I'm not that old, by the way, but there's National Geographic. I don't think the new generation have National Geographic coming to be delivered to their house anymore.
I have mine. I'm part of I sign up for the newsletter and I get like National Geographic magazines, and I love reading those because it's free research that I use for my own studies and my own research. And it's so much fun because you learn new things in National Geographic that you never knew. And for me, the magazine I always treasure is to this day, one of them is the Black Pharaohs of Egypt. I knew nothing of that. I didn't even know Egyptian history at the time. But as I've gotten older and have researched more and expanded my knowledge of classical and ancient history, you learn about the kings of Kush who came into Egypt and ruled for a good period in time. And no one talks about that. And for those who don't know what the Kingdom of Kush is, that is, to my knowledge, modern day Sudan. Yes. And it's like, no one knows that. But it's a period of history that doesn't get talked about, but it should. And I loved reading that article in National Geographic because I was blown away. And I think, tying back to your podcast, what you're doing is that you're showing people the other sides of Cleopatra, which, again, I will have to credit you. I mean, your podcast is For your episode, it's phenomenal. It's really, really good.
Thank you. And I need to make a note that Sudan has more pyramids than Egypt.
Yes, that is also true, listeners. And if you look it up, it is actually true. There's a lot more pyramids in Sudan than there is in Egypt. And even if you look at the structures, they're kind of almost very similar, some would say, to the Egyptian pyramids, which, it's always been a debate about, where the pyramids come from, how they were built. There's a lot of mystery in there. But with history, that's the ultimate thing, finding the truth.
Yes, yes, yes. And I wanted to do with the podcast, I'm not doing any timeline period specific, like starting with ancient world and Cleopatra and then the ancient queen. I'm just it's going to be just a lineup of different periods of women because next
Right.
week episode is going to be Isabella of France.
Ooh.
Wife of King Edward II and Queen of England and Princess of France, and she was known as a femme fatale and the she-wolf of France.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
and then I think I'm going to do Amarynlis, the Queen of Kush, that defeated Caesar.
Yes.
Mary, Queen of Scots.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm doing Joanna of Castile, that is King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain's daughter.
Nice. And
So
since you brought up, oh, sorry.
that's okay. You can go ahead.
I was gonna say, speaking of your podcast and selecting these women, do you have like a little list or criteria of like women that you want to feature on your podcast? Is it more of like who has the more interesting backstory, or one that has had a lot of discussions in the historical community?
It's a mixture of both and a mixture of that some of them are not really known also. So it's a mixture of that some of them are demonized or demonized like Cleopatra. Isabella of France is demonized because she's called the she-wolf of France.
Right.
Some of them are said to be crazy, like Joanna of Castile.
Yes.
So some of them are not known, like Amarynlis of Kush. So it's a mixture of all of these reasons.
Nice, nice. And yeah, I mean, just from those that list right there, the one I'm actually really excited is Amarynlis of Kush, because when I first learned about it, I was like, yes, I need to know more. And not only as a historian, but also as a writer and author, I'm actually going to use her to be based off of a character that I'm writing about. It's an alternate world where Carthage wins, it beats Rome, and becomes the dominant power in the Mediterranean. And it follows like this alternate family now where ultimately the Barca family marries a descendant of Amarynlis of Kush, and her family and her line go to Carthage, and ultimately North Africa expands into sub-Saharan Africa and becomes the most dominant power in not only the Mediterranean world, but also the Antiquities era and into the early medieval era, which I think it's very, very fascinating. That goes into alternate history, but still, research is definitely needed to explore.
Alternate history is tricky though, because
Yes.
you don't want to, because they advise you, people in the industry advise you not to, when you're writing your alternative history book, not to use characters that are well known. Like if you 100 years ago later, somebody's going to write about King Charles, they will advise you not to write about King Charles.
Yes, that is definitely true. When it comes into alternate history, you definitely need to be very, very careful because, as I'm sure you may have seen or read some books for alternate history, which they can be to the far extreme, which makes no sense. But then you have those that are grounded in facts and lore of that time to think, okay, well, this probably could have happened. Here are the things that could have changed. And you have to do the same thing. Time after Cleopatra, like the battle of, I believe the battle was of Actium. I could be
Yeah,
wrong. Oh
actually,
yes, it was. Like the battle of Actium could have gone either way. You could write a whole story where Cleopatra and Antony beat Augustus Caesar at the battle of Actium, and then explore, okay, now how would that world look like? Because Mark Antony, his whole goal was to make his own empire that wasn't Roman, that he always viewed he was Julius' successor. But that's a whole alternate history. And also for Cleopatra, how would she fare? That's a whole other lore and story, but still tying back, it has to be grounded in facts. And then leading to this question, because alternate history is geared towards a specific audience. And you may have mentioned this before, but when creating your podcasts and choosing the women you want to feature, um, who do you create for? In the sense, do you create these episodes for yourself because you may enjoy, your person that would enjoy these, is those made by someone else? Or do you create for a broad audience to expand the historical discussion?
okay. So this has like a three-part answer.
All right.
Yes, I create for myself because when I was growing up and even when I was at university, I would have liked to have a podcast and listen to a podcast about women in badass women, instead of always hearing about men or women being demonized. Also, I am creating the podcast for a general, broader audience to increase the historical discussions because these women have been erased or
Mm-hmm.
demonized. So people need to know more about these women. And I want to bring these women into mainstream culture, mainstream media.
Well, I definitely think that is a very, very great venture to do. Because, yes, I've always, as myself, as a historian, I've always made a mission to always, bring historical discussions to the forefront, to bring about, elements of history that have been forgotten and obscure, because I feel that does a disservice to the historical community, because there's so many stories that have been forgotten or erased or don't get talked about. And some of these discussions are uncomfortable, but they're needed, because how else are we going to have debates on history if we don't talk about these discussions and analyze them critically to think, okay, well, this is what happened. These are the discussions that are being brought up for this topic. Is there a middle ground, or is there another perspective? And in the case of badass women of history, as you said, history is written by the victors. And if you're looking historically, the world was dominated by men, men in power. And some of these women, either they were in their home native country, were often made obscure and ostracized. And I don't think that's, fair, or right, because these women made huge leaps in their country's history or in world history, and they, in a way, laid the foundation groundwork for future badass women to take up arms and pretty much flip
Yep.
the narrative.
Yes, yes, yes. And basically, the podcast is a feminist womanist podcast.
Right. And I definitely, it actually, it's funny that you brought that up, because I remember in one of my classes that I had to take, was talking about, uh, what was it? It was a discussion of, feminism and women's history in the classical period. And I was thinking, that's an interesting class title. But it's like the professor who presented a great history of this, like, oh, this actually really does change the perspective of, the ancient world. Because the one thing I've always found interesting, and maybe you've also come across this too in your research, is we tend to apply modern day thinking to the classical period when it comes to either positions of power, social structure, social hierarchy. And I often think that's kind of like a dangerous thing to do in a sense. If we look at in a case of feminist history, and just want to say right now, not well versed in feminist history, but from what I have learned in my basic understanding from my professors, is that we tend to apply more modern feminist ideology and thinking in the past. And I often think, and maybe you may agree with this, that saying that that's probably not the best way to explore if you were saying exploring women's history in the classical period, because that kind of changes the different story and may put things in there that don't necessarily need to be there or should be there.
Well, yes, you're not supposed to use the modern lens in modern lens to interpret history, whether it's feminist or women's history or not.
Right.
But in some cases, the modern lens and the ancient lens do line up.
Yes, I will agree. In some situations, they do line up and they do fit perfectly. And in other cases, sometimes it's best not to look through the modern lens for any history, which I definitely think is important. Now,
Oh, sorry.
oh, sorry. Oh, no, sorry. I'll let you continue.
I was going to say that we have this modern lens and women were oppressed in the ancient world. And yes, that is somewhat true, but we have to take a nuisance take on it, because in a lot of ancient societies, women had considerable rights
I definitely
for their
100%
time.
agree.
So while we may think in the modern world that these rights were enough, they in the ancient world will think, well, this is a lot of rights compared to other societies. Because when Julius Caesar, for example, went into Gaul, he realized the women were more free than Roman women. So
Mm-hmm.
he made a note of that in his writings.
Definitely. And you actually bring up a really great point. You know, in the historical discussions and debates, we have always believed that, women in the classical period and even the medieval period had less rights than um, the men at the time. And depending on the region and depending on what era in history you're exploring and through whose lenses, yes, that may be the case. But it's also important to note in other regions, women were actually sometimes, the dominant force, not in a sense of the political sense, but sometimes in the family sense that they were the dominant house or had the dominant authority. And if you look at Greece, ancient Greece, and in more case, the women of Sparta, those women, from the source that we have, were very, very well respected. They were educated, they were trained. And for listeners who may have seen the movie 300, there's one line that actually they omitted um, from history or that from film, which is in Sparta, there's only two types of people that are allowed to get headstones: those who have died in battle, those who have died in childbirth. Because in the Greek world and any Greek society, that was considered a duty of the state. So the Greeks heavily view that as this is essential, this is important to our culture and to who we are. And if you go into not just the classical Mediterranean world, but into Central Asia and in Asia and Japan, the women there were immensely powerful. You have stories of women in China who became One became an emperor, not empress, emperor, and ruled for a very, very long time. So, yeah, tying it all together, we have to acknowledge that while in the classical period and medieval period, women may have been considered by the male counterparts as inferior, but in other cases, they were not to be messed with, and they had, in some cases, more rights than the men, depending on the society and culture.
And the period of history.
Yes, that is true, and the period of history. So, another fun question I want to ask you is when it comes for you, when it comes to your presentation of history, who are your biggest inspirations when it comes to storytelling into like presenting history? Because each historian, whether it's in a book or in a documentary, they have their own unique style to storytelling and the teaching of history. So, who are your biggest inspirations when it comes to historical storytelling?
Wow. I have to go back to Bethany Hughes. Hughes. I love her storytelling. I watch all her documentaries. I do like. Oh my God, I can forget his name right now. I forgot his name. He did the history of English many years ago of the history English language. I forgot his name. He did for BBC. I forgot his name. His name is on tip of my finger. I don't think he's a necessarily a historian, but I liked how he delivered it in on television.
Nice. And actually, another little tangent question is for those who don't know the scholar you have referred to, um, who is this historian scholar and why does he have such an impression on you?
I'm trying to remember his name. I can't. It's not coming to me. I probably would have to go back on YouTube to see if it's the documentary still there, or Google and find out his name. He's not. I don't think he's a historian per se. I think he's
Hmm.
just a television presenter, just delivering the facts. I also like another historian. I just their names are not. Oh, I like Lucy Wallet. Wallace, Wallace. She does the British history to the history period.
Hmm.
I'm her name right now, her last name. I think I'm pronouncing it wrong.
I don't think I know that. The first name sounds familiar because I don't know, but I think I'll probably find it as well. Because if I know it is, I'll probably send it to you. But yeah, that name sounds definitely very familiar. And you also mentioned, of course, famous Egyptologists that have also had a huge impression on you and stuff like that. Would you say, out of all the historians that you've mentioned, who's probably the one that you really have the great connection with in terms of like you understand the material, you like how they're presenting history, and overall their character?
I like Cara Cooney, and I do like Bethany Hughes. So those are the two. Yeah,
Nice, very nice.
and I do like Henry Louis Gates.
Oh yes, I love his work too, especially his show Finding Your Roots.
Yes,
I've
I do.
always watched that. It's very very fascinating to find out, the ancestry of people and where we all come from, because we all have a story, and it's very fascinating to know where we come from in our own history, because it makes us who we are, and it tells us where our families came from, and it's quite an eye-opening experience, I say.
And I do also like St. Lucian history historian June Sommer. I think she's known worldwide, but she is one of my favorite Caribbean historians. I do like, oh my God, I forgot his name right now. So Hilary Beckles, he is a great
Hmm.
historian. He's Barbadian, but he is a Caribbean historian, and he's known worldwide because he's done BBC and CNN and all that stuff. And so but his moment in time is all about Caribbean slavery, um, early Caribbean, 20th century, late
Right.
19th century. So I do like him. Yeah.
Nice. Very nice. And would you say those are the historians that you think not they don't overtly like challenge you to do something better, but you've seen their work and that makes you want to push yourself to be a
Yeah.
better historian?
Yes. 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 Yes.
Nice. Very
And
nice.
I like how they connect issues, other issues with the history. And sometimes Cara Coney connects history and race um, with her what she's talking about, her documentaries or her podcasts. Hilary Beck does the same thing. He interjects class and race into his speeches and his talks. During summer, she um, in, she interacts with history and gender. So I like how they do other.
Nice. That's actually really cool. And I definitely also have to agree when as historians we always want to push ourselves and really try to challenge ourselves and really in a sense go out of our own fields to explore other topics of history. And when we look to the titans or the greats in the fields or in other fields, we want to see that's something I want to do, that these are the people that I want to be like. And this is a two-part question, and you may have already answered this previously, but at this period of you are right now with your podcast as well as your own writings, who would you say have been your biggest supporters? And have you ever had like a sense of validation from a fellow historian that may have seen your work and told you this is really good and this is where you belong?
Wow. Um, well, I did when I did my Twitter thread on oh god, her name is not coming to me. Have just half what was her? She was an Egyptian queen, and now her name is not coming to me. That's really bad for me to not forget. um, Cara Crowley. I kind of liked it and commented, and when I did my Twitter thread on Amarenas, lots of historians. That thread went viral on Twitter.
Nice.
And then I reshared it on Facebook, on my Facebook page, and it went viral there. And so I had a lot of professors from biblical studies and historians supporting, um, liking, and retweeting that. I also had support from my fellow podcasters because I have been on other podcasts and they have been supportive of me, especially with my writing.
Awesome. That's actually really cool. It's really cool that you've been getting a lot of recognition for your writings and for your works, especially also for your podcast, because I always like new historians coming about and presenting their own works, especially in podcast form, because it definitely helps expand the historian community, which I feel is speaking with other friends who are fellow historians saying the historian community is a very small, tight-knit community, and I think it's important that we all help each other. So it's good to see that you've gotten a lot of positive feedback and praise for your writings and for your work.
Yes, I'm happy too about that.
Awesome.
But I would do want to say that history is not only my only field. So
Hmm.
I dabble. I do have other interest in biblical studies, which a biblical study can sometimes go end up you end up when you go into biblical studies, you end up researching the ancient classical period, especially the
Right.
Roman period. So
Hmm.
sometimes that clashes together. So I do a lot of biblical studies also, and pop culture critic. I'm also do a lot of pop culture critic, especially when it comes to history
Hmm.
and mental health and gender and race.
Well, you are definitely well versed and definitely branched out into a lot of great fields.
Yeah.
And we are now nearing the end. And before we get to the closing statement, there is one last question I do want to ask. It's probably the most important one. Um, in your experience, as a theologian, as a historian, as a writer, blogger, what do you think um is like probably one of the biggest how can I phrase this in a way, going back to what we said earlier about applying our own modern interpretations of history is detrimental. um in your experience as a writer and theologian, what would you say are like the biggest issues affecting history, in your opinion and based on your experience?
I realized what's affecting history is that it is a very close knitted club. Not necessarily close knitted, but very like it's inclusive and it's hard to, it's like their own little sorority or fraternity club. And I noticed that, well, but that's a lot of academia in a whole, though. I believe, in my opinion, that
Hmm.
it's hard to break into that. And also another problem is there are not a lot of women and people of color, especially in certain fields like ancient history and medieval history, you know.
Definitely. And we seem to be now nearing the end of our discussion. And before we end our wonderful interview, my last question to you is, what is your word of wisdom to other historians out there or people who wish to pursue history as a career?
Don't give up. And it's a long road, it's exhausting, and sometimes you don't see any rewards or benefits. But if this is what it's in your heart and what you enjoy and what you want to make your living, don't give up. It will eventually come to pass.
Very well spoken. Best way to end. And with that, listeners, we come to the end of this wonderful historians interview. I want to thank our guest, Princess Onaika Auguste,
Auguste.
Princess Onaika Auguste, for joining us. And where can people find and engage with you? And where can they find your podcast and your blog?
Okay, so you can follow me on Instagram at Isle Theologian, or for my podcast Instagram page, it's Badass Women of History pre 1700s, because Badass Women of History was already taken apparently. So I had to add pre 1700s because I'm not going further than the 1700s. And so you can also follow me on Twitter at Isles Theologian. Um, so when you subscribe to my Twitter page on on Badass Women of History pre-1700s. You will see the link of Anchor, Spotify, of where my podcast is, and you can subscribe if inclined to my Ko-fi, where you get a lot of my writings, and on my Patreon, where you also get a lot of my writings, and they are all at Isle Theologian.
Awesome. Awesome. I'll link all of those in the description below so you can follow her, as well as the link to her podcast for her first episode of Cleopatra. And again, listeners, I want to thank our guests for joining us today. Princess Onaika Auguste, thank you so much for joining us. You've been a fantastic guest. This has been probably a great historical discussion and probably a nice one to have. I haven't had another historian discussion in a long time since this year, so thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. Well, listeners, this concludes our historian's interview on Tales from the Wandering Scribe. I am your host, Gabriel Garcia, the Wandering Quill and Wandering Scribe, signing out. Thank you, everybody.